This podcast is Challenging Opinions and is presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading the Challenging Opinions podcast for May 20th, 2019. The American economy has been called the Great Car Economy. The automobile could hardly be more central to the American way of life, not to mention its capitalist system. Let's talk to someone who thinks it shouldn't be.
Challenging Opinions is the podcast where ideas are tested. Whether you are left or right, conservative or progressive, devout or skeptic. What matters is the strength of your argument, not the strength of your voice.
Here's what we've got coming up for you in this podcast. Everybody would be better off if everybody did that, but each individual is better off if they don't.
No, but that's not true. Just look at the drivers. Like, tell me that person feels they're better off when they're just like sitting in traffic, just looking pissed off, honking their horn, breathing exhaust fumes, not getting where they're going. This is daily.
That's coming up shortly. But first, I'm back. Sorry for the unplanned hiatus. I was a bit unwell for a while, but I'm back and there are lots of interesting shows coming up. Thanks to all of you for your patience, and of course thanks to all my donors on Patreon. I really appreciate everyone who contributes. Patreon, if you don't know, is basically a system that allows people to donate $1 or $2 per podcast or per month. That helps me to devote more time to research and finding interesting guests. If you think you could do the same as them, there's details on the website and also at the end of the show. There have been a couple of stories about facial recognition in the news recently. This audio is from a BBC report where British police set up a van with cameras filming passers-by and searching for records on them based on facial recognition.
This man didn't want to be caught by the police cameras, so he covered his face. Police stopped him. They photographed him anyway. An argument followed.
How would you like it if you walk down the street and someone grabbed you? Hold yourself down, you go and hang up. That's you.
What's your suspicion?
One man decided that he didn't like that and pulled his sweater up over his mouth and nose to frustrate the camera system.
The chap told me down the road, he said he got facial recognition. So I walked past like that. It's a cold day as well. As I've done that, the police officers asked me to come to him, so I've got me back up. I said to him...
The police stopped him, forced him to be photographed and fined him £90, about $115, for what they called disorderly conduct.
There you go, look at that. Thanks lads, £90.
There was no suggestion that he was guilty of any crime, at least of any other crime, if you call not wanting to be filmed a crime. That was a trial. The police brought a BBC camera crew along with them to film the demonstration, and it was notable that 3 other people were arrested when the cameras and the associated computer system recognised them as people who had outstanding warrants against them. Compare that to the story of another British man, this time in the French port city of Calais. He'll go on trial shortly for an incident that started when police noticed that he was filming them. He says that the police attacked a woman he was with without provocation. The 2 of them were recording police behaviour. There's an ongoing dispute at migrant camps around Calais, where volunteers distributing food to migrants say that they're suffering intense harassment from the French police. Amnesty International have said that the charges are an abusive process and should be dropped. The man faces large fines and up to 5 years in prison if he's convicted. This has echoes of the Glick versus Cunniff case in the United States, where the Supreme Court ruled that citizens have the right to film public officials, including police, who are working in public. There's a clear case here to say that what's good for the goose is good for the gander. People have a right to film in public space. It has a good effect too. People, at least the police, who know that their actions are being recorded are more likely to behave in a decent way. But facial recognition is a whole new technology. It's notable that San Francisco has banned its use in public. This is not just filming people. It's effectively looking up each person in a database just because they went out in public. Now, the UK operation that led to one man being stopped and fined for pulling up his sweater, that's essentially the equivalent of setting up a checkpoint and saying that nobody is allowed to pass until they've given their ID and been checked. Is that justified? It certainly seems like a scary new use of technology, but that alone is not a valid argument against it. You can't rationally say that while the rest of society moves on, law enforcement must only use technology invented before an arbitrary date. But new technology has given governments ways of violating rights that were never before contemplated. If the police can use facial recognition to look up all passers-by in a database of, say, outstanding warrants, then the police could use facial recognition to record all passers-by in a database. That's the electronic equivalent of putting a checkpoint on every street corner and not letting anyone pass unless they produce an ID and have their movements recorded. If you don't immediately see why that's incompatible with democracy, then two things. One, you don't know the difference between democracy and a police state, and two, you're going to learn about that difference pretty soon. But remember, in that UK trial, the police arrested 3 wanted men. That's the electronic equivalent of a cop spotting a fugitive in the street and collaring them. Should we really complain about that? This has the potential to take a lot of criminals off the street and be a much more efficient use of resources. My opinion is this. If something is already permissible, there's no good argument for saying that the same thing done electronically rather than by a human is a violation. So spotting a crook in the street, either by person or by machine, fine. But when something is clearly impermissible when done by humans, there's no justification for saying that because we can do the same thing by machine and be more subtle about it, it becomes acceptable. It doesn't. So the devil is in the detail here. We could say, if the system is programmed only to flag fugitives for the police to arrest, then that's okay. But if it's programmed to record everyone who passes for the authorities to use later as they see fit, that's not okay. But that would require an independent audit of the entire system being used. Let's see how fast the police forces are willing to agree to that.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you want your point of view heard, email podcast@challengingopinions.com and say what you think.
On the line now, I have Aaron Naparstek. He is a co-host of the podcast The War on Cars. He's also a founder of the streetsblog.org. But really, I'm interested in the war on cars, Aaron. And I know this rhetorical trick. Usually it's used with the war on women or the war on Christmas, and it's from people who want to claim that they're being victimized. Are you defending victimized car drivers?
No, that's backwards. It's more like we're defending victimized cities and the people who live in them, and the way in which they are victimized by car-oriented transportation systems. And it's kind of a cheeky, it's a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek name. I'd been pretty involved in bike advocacy and transit advocacy in New York City for many years. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that always came up and still comes up whenever you sort of try to reallocate street space away from cars and to bikes and buses, and you take a parking spot away from a car and replace it with a bike rack on the street, and somebody inevitably will show up to the meeting and say, you guys are waging a war on cars. And came up so often that we decided, what the heck, let's just be the war on cars. They're accusing us of it anyways.
And why would anybody be at war with cars?
Well, right. So there really is no war on cars, technically, beyond our podcast. But why would you be at war on cars? A lot of reasons. Cars are just a really inappropriate transportation technology for cities. Cars and cities do not mix. And we have, unfortunately, in North America, made our cities unfortunately, in North America, we've essentially made it almost impossible to get around any other way other than having a car. And when you go to our biggest cities, particularly cities with like decent transit and cities with places where people could potentially be walking and biking and getting around by other modes, we've made it dangerous and inconvenient and kind of unpleasant and gross to get around because we have essentially jam-packed our public spaces, our streets, with motor vehicles.
You live in New York. How do you get around?
Well, I get around by every mode. I bike a lot, take the subway a lot, take the bus every once in a while, walk all the time. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I, use a car too. So
for people, and you say you bike a lot, so just focusing on that for the moment, what's up with that? Who's interfering with your ability to cycle around New York City?
Well, I have a pretty specific take on that, and I think the people who are interfering the most with our ability to bike safely in the city are the people who are parking their cars on the curbside, on the street for free, on virtually every street in the city. And I say that because we could have an incredible network of protected bike lanes in this city and in many cities. Bike lanes that would enable like an 8-year-old kid and an 80-year-old grandma to bike safely, to do most of their daily chores by bicycle, if we had protected bike lanes. And the thing that seems to be most in the way of getting a proper bike network built in New York and lots of other cities is the fact that we have just sort of given over our streets for people's personal car storage as a place for people. The street is essentially a gigantic parking lot. And it's kind of a mind-boggling thing if you think about it, that, in a big crowded city where a tiny studio apartment in New York City can cost as much as like $4,500 a month. And yet you, like, right in front of that apartment, you can have a street space with a gigantic SUV that is parked for free in the same amount of space that this $4,500 a month apartment, takes up. So we have this bizarre thing where we give away the street for free for car storage. And I think that's the thing that is most in the way of biking, actually.
But what you're saying is just essentially you're going to get the city to, either through parking charges or whatever, to jack up taxes on people. If people are paying $4,500 a month in rent, surely they need a bit of a break, and letting them have a parking space could be that.
Well, no, first of all, there's a lot of different tools that you could use to start to make this change happen. Not just, and actually, I do think that parking your car on the street should cost money, but it mostly doesn't now. But one of the reasons why it's so expensive to live in New York and other cities is because we use our public space so poorly. Space where you see parking lots or even cars parked on the street could theoretically be used for housing actual human beings. Every time there is a big real estate development project in Brooklyn, New York, where I live, a bunch of people show up at a community meeting and say, you can't build more housing here. You're going to create more traffic congestion, because the assumption is every single new person is going to create, is going to need a place to park and is going to be driving more in more cars. And the fact that we can't build more housing because people are worried about traffic means that housing is more expensive. So we've created like it's an economically insane way to organize the city, to just sort of give space away for free to cars, when the cars themselves will end up making things more expensive and less convenient for everyone, including the car drivers themselves, by the way.
Pause with that for a moment, because I just want you to listen to a very quick clip. This is from a PragerU YouTube video. PragerU is a right-wing YouTube channel, but they have very highly produced videos, and they're financed by oil billionaires. But just let's listen to the very quick clip.
Cars are more than just another way to get from point A to point B. They allow us to go wherever we want, whenever we want, with whomever we want. Think about it. With trains, planes, and buses, the routes are planned, and the schedule is timed. Only cars allow you to be spontaneous. When you get behind the wheel, you are in control. You are free.
I can hear you rolling your eyes from here, Aaron. But there's an essential point there that, whether you agree with it or not, I think most Americans have internalized that driving a car, getting your first driving license, that's a moment of freedom, isn't it?
Well, I certainly felt that way. You know, at the time when I got my driver's license, I lived in a suburb of Cleveland, Ohio. Mm-hmm. And there were really no other ways for me to get around at that time, because we spent most of the 20th century building a habitat in North America, building a pattern of settlement that was entirely oriented around the automobile. So yes, this is true that in most places around North America, you really do need car, and there aren't very many options. And I think I'm imagining that the woman who, narrated, or the people who produced that PragerU video, they probably don't live in New York City because, it's very obvious when you're in a big city today, Boston, New York, DC, Seattle, Los Angeles, go down the list, Houston. The thing that's preventing you from having freedom of movement and real mobility is everyone's car. You are sitting in lots of traffic. You are stuck on these like hellish suburban arterials. This is really the tragedy of the commons, isn't it? Everybody's individual car is their freedom, but everybody else's car is blocking that freedom, and everybody's car, everybody who is attempting to use their car to arrive at freedom is blocking that for everybody else. I can see what you're saying there, but it's the case, really, isn't it, that there doesn't seem to be an easy way around that? Well, that's not true. There are easy ways around that, and we have plenty of examples of cities that are doing otherwise than forcing everybody to own and insure and fuel and maintain a car to get around a city. You go to places in Asia, you go to places in Europe, South America. There are plenty of places that have built great transit systems, have made it possible to do short trips on bikes, have made the walking environment totally great and pleasant and convenient and safe. So, this is not rocket science. I mean, and this is frankly how we built cities, towns, and villages for thousands of years before the car. Mm-hmm. The car is a pretty new invention. And the notion of a city filled with cars is just an invention of the last 60, 70, 80 years, since World War II. So, we can do this, but it does require, it's a political problem more than a technical problem. It really involves convincing people that, hey, we would all be better off in the city if we collectively decided, we're going to start to push the car.
Sure, yeah, but that's a precise description of the tragedy of the commons, that everybody would be better off if everybody did that, but each individual is better off if they don't.
No, but that's not true. That's just not true. I mean, look at the drivers. Like, tell me that person feels they're better off when they're just like sitting in traffic, just looking pissed off, honking their horn, breathing exhaust fumes, not getting where they're going. This is daily in our.
Oh, hold on, you did an episode on your podcast of this, of contrasting what car ads look like with the reality of them. maybe go through that for us.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, the classic car ad is selling you, exactly the opposite of the experience of driving in a city. So, you see a car speeding around, an urban environment with no other cars around it. You're going like 60 miles an hour down the street. And then lo and behold, you're like at the top of a mountain, or you're, fjording, you're fording a river, in your SUV. I mean, these are things that you're never going to actually experience, in your car when you're picking up your kid from soccer practice and you're 15 minutes late because, I don't know, somebody was double parked, at a busy intersection. Yeah, I mean, this is the thing is like the motor vehicle, the automakers, they know they have to sell you a fantasy because the reality of an automobile-based transportation system in cities is terrible. It's a terrible user experience for everybody. And I think most of all for the drivers. I mean, that's why I owned a car. I got rid of it because it was just a terrible, humongous albatross, around my neck at all times. And I'm so much happier not owning it. Which is not to say that I never drive. I've become like a big fan of something that we have in New York and a bunch of other cities now called Car2Go, which is just a car share. So when I do need a car, I can just walk up to a car, click a button on an app on my phone, and boom, I have a car for 41 cents a minute. And I really think that something like that, is probably the future of cars in cities. So whereas I don't have to pay for the gas or the insurance or the maintenance, I don't have to really bother too much about parking it and moving it on, street cleaning days when I'll get a ticket if I leave it at the curb. The car is owned by a fleet, by a big company. So they could even like start to do things like make sure that like their drivers are driving safely and it's like, hey, buddy, hi, Aaron, I've noticed you're, exceeding the speed limit a lot in your Car2Go. Could you please, be a little more careful? They don't do that now, but I'm just saying in theory, like they could do that. We could have a much better system if people didn't, we could still have cars, but if people didn't have to own and operate a car for themselves, it would just work much better for cities. Sorry if I'm babbling.
Please keep babbling. That's what we have on this show. But what I want to get more into is the way in which I think you on your podcast are unafraid to attack the culture that's around cars. And people tend to, I think, when they campaign on this issue, they tend to try not to offend people like that Prager video and say, no, we don't want to take away your freedom to drive everywhere. But one thing that it strikes me is that if you have a lot of cars, and I've been to cities that have very few, and there are cities with no cars at all, just because of the way they were built, maybe 1,000 years ago or more. Most cities in America were built much more recently, but they are much more dense, which means that people are just closer to everything. Everything you want is closer to you because you don't have to devote a huge amount of land to parking and to wide streets that people can drive through. And particularly from your point of view, it might be a pessimistic take, but every time you build another freeway, you're putting that amount of space between people and where they want to get to, which means you'll need another freeway. I'm not sure that there's a way out of that downward spiral.
Right. It's really tricky to know what to do with suburban sprawl and all of the sprawl that we've built around North America. There are certainly places that are suburban, that are not in the centers of big cities, that we could start to retrofit and create more density in places like, old malls out in the suburbs. Malls are dying all over the country. They're really not. It's a really terrible business now, the whole mall business, and those are places that are ripe for becoming kind of like dense urban cores, and that's starting to happen in a few places. There are other places that are just so far flung that I think they will become, financially difficult to support in the coming years. That's a big problem with sprawl is that, when we spread ourselves out across the landscape, we also spread out all of the services we need to live, so a electricity and sewer lines and water pipes and fire departments. And, you need to sort of have all of this infrastructure spread across this vast distance. And I actually think that it's the financial unsustainability of that's going to ultimately doom a lot of it. But then some of it's also just going to probably be doomed by changing climate and, places that we've built in the Sun Belt that, are sucking water out of like the Colorado River, hundreds of miles away or whatever. Those places are also probably going to become unsustainable. It would be nice if we could, instead of just having like a chaotic retreat from these unsustainable places, if we could, do some smart planning and get people to move away from them. Mm-hmm. But that's going to be a big fight. That's going to be hard.
Do you think maybe that you might have been born on the wrong continent, that if you were advocating this in some Northern European country, they would be halfway there already. But in the US, even the cities where it is most plausible, New York or San Francisco perhaps, it is not a popular opinion that you're promoting. And in most other cities in the US, it's off the deep end. There's no audience for that at all.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, I love, visiting Amsterdam and Copenhagen and going to places that have, done transportation really well. But no, I don't think I'm in the wrong place. In fact, this stuff actually is very popular in New York and other big cities. It doesn't feel that way sometimes because, drivers and cars take up a lot of space. So they feel bigger and more omnipresent than they really are. But the fact is that, a substantial majority of New York City residents do not own a car, even though the vast majority of our public space is given to cars. So we're giving this incredible asset that we have as a city, our streets, our public spaces, away to a minority of people who use it. Might I
point out a relatively powerful minority?
Well, but it's funny. Their power is like from a kind of in a kind of status quo way. It's just their power derives from the fact that like this is how it is. But we've seen amazing amounts of change take place in just the last 10 or 15 years, where streets in New York City and lots of other North American cities are really starting to be reconfigured away from the car. So, for example, a place that lots of people would know about, Times Square in the middle of Manhattan, where you do the big New Year's Eve celebration. For about 40 years, they were talking about like in Times Square, it makes no sense that we have all this car traffic moving through it. It's gridlocked. It's terrible. Everybody's honking their horns and not moving anywhere. Why don't we make it car free? And that was a discussion for literally from starting in the 1960s. And it was just sort of, nothing would happen. It just seemed too big, too complicated. And then finally, this new wave of advocacy started in the mid 2000s. A lot of it, I think, was very much empowered by the internet and the ease with which people could organize and share ideas. And pretty quickly, Times Square went through this kind of iterative process and became mostly car free. And that was just one example. There were lots of small examples and lots of streets that started to get new bike lanes and dedicated bus lanes. And I mean, cities are really moving in this direction now.
You call it a war. Are you winning or losing?
I mean, on a personal level, I walk outside of my house every day and I'm just like, damn, we are losing the war on cars. Just this morning, there was like, a double parked truck in front of my house on the street in Brooklyn, and, a bunch of people on either side of this guy just honking their horns and, pissed off and not going anywhere. So, I think, on a lot of days I wake up and I think we're losing. I visit a place in Ohio, like where my sister lives, and I think, oh my God, this place is never going to have functional transit. But then other times I look at the progress that's happening, and there's a lot of it, and I think we're winning. So I can go either way. It depends when you catch me.
I mentioned they're powerful people, and I don't often quote Marx, but he did say some interesting things once in a while. And one thing Marx said that's Karl Marx, by the way, people, not Groucho,
Sure.
said that the dominant ideas in society are the ideas of the dominant people in society. And you mentioned that only a minority of New Yorkers have cars, but they dominate. And that's a real challenge for you, for somebody, who is wanting to change the way that transport works. However well you can advocate what you would like it to be, and however well you can point out that it might be a way more livable city, much more pleasant and safer place to be. Even if you have a majority, you don't have a majority of the dominant people. Isn't that true?
Well, I mean, I don't know about that really. We have this, New York City is governed by a mayor and we have a city council. And the city council tends to be, right now it's mostly a pretty young group of people, really like progressive and activist. It just happens to be the character of this city council. And the speaker, the leader of the city council, just stood up and gave his first State of the City speech. 37-year-old guy, technically the first millennial to be a, millennial generation guy to be in a citywide office in New York. And he delivered a speech that was basically just like the war on cars manifesto. This is a guy who could be the mayor of New York City in 3 years, very easily, and I think there is a younger generation that is emerging and they're coming into power now, and they don't want the city to be like this, and they're going to change it. We live in the city of our parents and grandparents. I mean, it takes time to change a city. And our parents and grandparents, they thought that the automobile was not just the solution to a lot of problems, but was a kind of like, a symbol of freedom and a cultural icon and, like a thing that was going to...
it's not just your grandparents who thought that. Most Americans think that now. And aren't they perhaps right in thinking that you are wanting to symbolize taking away freedom?
Well, I mean, sure, they might think that, and maybe we need to figure out how to communicate these ideas better. But the fact is, like, we just want to, in the realm of transportation, we just want to move our persons and our goods from one place to the other, right? So the notion that a car equals freedom is totally irrelevant. Like, what would be freedom for a person in a city is if a bus came down their local avenue, every 5 minutes, and it was inexpensive and convenient and on time and had its own dedicated lane. And you could just literally I don't feel like walking. I'm just going to hop on this bus and this people mover is going to take me to the place I need to go. That would be freedom too. But, I think that's not how we have conceived freedom in America. So it is a new idea, and, new ideas take time. But, I think it's like self-evident that the car is not freedom. It's so expensive to, maintain and fuel up, to insure, to repair, to buy in the first place. It sits stuck in traffic. It kills people at alarming numbers, like 40,000 people a year are killed by cars in the United States. It is, literally destroying the planet with fossil fuel emissions and our ability to live in civilization. I mean, it's so self-evident that the car is not freedom. And that is why automakers spend, hundreds of millions of dollars convincing us that the car is freedom. So, this is what it's a big machine, what we're up against. But I think people get it. I think people feel it and know it. And, at some point, the dam's going to break.
Aaron Naparstek, co-host of The War on Cars, thank you very much for talking to me.
Okay, thank you.
Never miss a show. You can subscribe to the podcast for free using iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, or any other podcast software or app. See challengingopinions.com/subscribe for details.
Go to the website for sources and links to what we were talking about. And while you're there, please like the show on Facebook, follow @ChallengingO on Twitter, and follow Aaron Naparstek @Naparstek, and follow The War on Cars @The War on Cars. And get in touch with me if you think you can suggest a guest or a topic for a future show. Also, thanks to everyone who's signed up as patrons on Patreon so far. I really appreciate that. It means I can devote more time to research and finding interesting guests. And if you could do the same as they've done and donate $1 or $2 per podcast or per month, you'll find the link on the website. Also, you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. It's all at www.challengingopinions.com. Coming up next Monday, that's May 27th, I'll be talking to the writer Grayson Kay about the mixed effects of the Me Too movement. The Challenging Opinions podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. Thank you for listening.